It was called historic.
That we will be doing a mandatory evacuation.
Unprecedented.
17 feet and just take all the homes out from underneath them again. People have just got them repaired.
A relentless siege from the sea, unlike anything since the 1930s. The 2005 Atlantic hurricane season shattered every record in the books, unleashing an historic 28 tropical cyclones, 15 hurricanes, and a still record-holding 7 major hurricanes. For the first time in history, 4 storms reached the top of the Saffir-Simpson scale. And in the end, over 1,700 lives were lost, and the storms that year inflicted more than $100 billion in damage, reshaping coastlines and entire communities. Now, 20 years later, the echoes of the devastating 2005 season still haunt us, reminding us of our vulnerability. But what have we truly learned from this catastrophic hurricane season? Join me to revisit the fury, the tragedy, and the profound lessons of one of the most active and costly hurricane seasons in history, uncovering insights that continue to shape the way we confront nature's ultimate wrath. I'm CJ Morgan, and this is Florida Man Weather. January 6th, 2006. Over 2 months after the official end of the 2005 hurricane season. And the final storm, Tropical Storm Zeta, has finally dissipated into a low-pressure system over the northern Atlantic. Over the past 8 months, the countries surrounding the western Atlantic basin, Gulf of Mexico, and Caribbean Sea have been ravaged in ways the modern world has truly never seen. 28 tropical cyclones had formed, 27 of them strong enough to earn a name, with 1 additional subtropical storm thrown into the mix. The numbers alone rewrote the record books. The long-standing benchmark of 21 named storms, set all the way back in 1933, wasn't merely surpassed, it was obliterated. This wasn't just a busy season, it was a relentless siege. 15 storms reached hurricane status, the most ever recorded in a single season, and 7 of those surged into major hurricanes, Category 3 or higher. But it was the ferocity within the ferocity that stunned even the most veteran meteorologists. For the first time in recorded history, 4 of those hurricanes had reached Category 5 intensity. These weren't just strong storms, they were meteorological monsters, breaking intensity records, exhausting forecast models, and overwhelming both the emergency responders and the public the world over. It was a year that forced forecasters to reach for names they'd never used before. Literally, the 2005 season went so far beyond the traditional alphabet that the National Hurricane Center was forced to utilize Greek letters to name these storms: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Epsilon, and yes, Zeta. Even the lesser-known storms had left scars. Hurricane Cindy, often forgotten amid the chaos that followed, surprised forecasters by briefly becoming a hurricane before striking Louisiana on July 5th, an ominous prelude to the destruction to come. Hurricane Emily stunned scientists by becoming the earliest Category 5 hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin, and it did so in July. Ophelia meandered off the East Coast, refusing to follow the usual movements of East Coast hurricanes, battering North Carolina's shores and Outer Banks with day after day of wind and rain. Stan, though only a Category 1, unleashed catastrophic flooding and deadly mudslides across Central America, becoming one of the deadliest storms of the year. Even Europe felt the season's reach when Tropical Storm Vince struck Spain, the first time in modern history a tropical system had done so. In all, the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season wasn't just extreme. It was a total breakdown of what forecasters had come to expect. It tested limits, shattered precedents, and demanded new conversations about what was possible. But amongst this onslaught of storms, a handful stood out as the most catastrophic, the most destructive, and the most unforgettable. Their names are burned into history, and their stories, the ones that follow, would come to define the 2005 season itself.
Just look at the surf kick up in Destin. Sure signs that Hurricane Dennis is close by, and you need to be prepared now. We only have a few hours left until this thing makes landfall.
The first major hurricane of 2005 was Hurricane Dennis, which developed in early July. And Dennis was an unusually intense July storm, barreling through the Caribbean as one of the first major hurricanes of the season, when on July 7th, Dennis became the strongest hurricane ever recorded before August, a mighty Category 4 with winds around 150 miles per hour, an almost unheard of intensity so early in the season. The storm slammed into Cuba twice, once as a 4 and once as a 3, before charging headfirst into the Gulf of Mexico and turning north towards the US Gulf Coast. While it had weakened from its peak intensity, Dennis still made its final landfall as a major hurricane, coming ashore as a Category 3 on July 10th over Santa Rosa Island, Florida, near Navarre Beach. Dennis brought with it a 115 mile per hour winds and a storm surge of 6 to 7 feet to coastal communities in the Florida Panhandle, causing significant damage in the Pensacola area before continuing onward into southern Alabama. Overall, Dennis was directly responsible for 42 deaths, mostly in Haiti and Cuba. Only 3 deaths of those were in the United States, and had caused over $2.2 billion in damage. As violent as July had been, August had started off rather tame. That was until on August 23rd, 2005, when the National Hurricane Center identified a developing area of low pressure drifting over the northern Bahamas. It was quite disorganized, barely more than a swirl of clouds and thunderstorms, but the atmosphere was primed and the water beneath it was warm and waiting. That morning, it was designated Tropical Depression 12. Slowly, steadily, it began to strengthen, inching westward towards the Florida coastline. By the afternoon of August 24th, it crossed the threshold to be titled as a tropical storm, and it also earned a name that would soon become seared into the American conscience: Katrina. Over the next day, Katrina's winds would gradually intensify, drawing strength from the surrounding ocean. On the evening of August 25th, the storm briefly reached hurricane status, Category 1, before making landfall near Keating Beach on Florida's east coast and crossing the southern part of the peninsula. Katrina unleashed heavy rain and wind on Florida. Then, as it emerged into the warm waters of the Gulf, everything changed. Beneath Katrina lay a vast expanse of superheated water, the warmest sea surface temperatures on record for that region, and the storm began to feed. Over the course of just 2 days, Katrina underwent explosive intensification. Its winds were now screaming at upward of 175 miles per hour, and its central pressure had plummeted to 902 millibars, making it still one of the most intense hurricanes ever recorded in the entire Atlantic basin. The storm had become a leviathan. Satellite images from August 28th showed a perfectly formed storm, an enormous symmetrical structure stretching across the Gulf, its giant eye calm, circular, and utterly foreboding. That same day, forecasters at the National Hurricane Center issued a dire warning that this could be the storm we've always feared for New Orleans. The nightmare scenario, the one emergency planners and government officials and the public alike simulated for years but prayed would never come, was now on hand.
This is the scenario that people in New Orleans have been fearing for a long time. A Category 5 hurricane headed right toward the city.
There's not a meteorologist or an expert that I have talked to that says that this storm will not impact New Orleans in a major way.
As Katrina approached, the Gulf Coast was put on high alert, and millions of people packed up and left the coastline. And for the very first time in its 287-year history, the city of New Orleans was placed under a mandatory evacuation order. Katrina weakened slightly as it neared the coast, but by then it hardly mattered. On the morning of August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall near Buras, Louisiana, with sustained winds between 125 and 130 miles an hour. Then, soon after, made a second landfall along the Louisiana-Mississippi border. But the true killer was not the storm's winds, it was the water. Katrina's storm surge reached up to a cataclysmic 30 feet on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, completely leveling coastal communities along the shoreline. Entire neighborhoods no longer existed as the cataclysmic storm surge penetrated inland, which in some areas along the Mississippi Gulf Coast reached almost 12 miles. Streets became rivers, and in most locations, like Bay St. Louis and Waveland, only empty foundations stood where buildings had once been. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, despite initial reports actually saying that the city had been spared, the city's worst fears were coming true. The city, mostly lying below sea level and protected by an aging and inadequate levee system, did not withstand the onslaught. The levees failed under the weight of Katrina's surge and relentless rainfall. Over 50 major breaches occurred throughout the flood protection system, and by sunrise on August 30th, an unimaginable sight had unfolded. Nearly 80% of the city was underwater. The lower 9th Ward and St. Bernard Parish were submerged by almost 15 feet of water up to the rooftops on most homes. People who would stay behind, many of whom were elderly, poor, or disabled, found themselves trapped. Some clawed their ways into their attics, others clung to rafters, and from rooftop they waved and screamed for help. In the chaos that followed, New Orleans descended into a humanitarian disaster. Though roughly 80% of residents had actually evacuated before Katrina made landfall, the tens of thousands that were left behind weren't so lucky. With floodwaters cutting off access to nearly everything, essential services collapsed. Emergency responders, themselves overwhelmed, struggled to locate and rescue survivors. The Louisiana Superdome, which was designated as the shelter of last resort, quickly turned into a symbol of desperation. Thousands packed into the sweltering stadium, enduring days of heat, darkness, and dwindling supplies. Sewage backed up, tempers flared, and help for many seemed agonizingly slow to arrive. In total, Katrina had claimed over 1,500 lives across Louisiana and Mississippi, making it the deadliest U.S. hurricane in nearly a century. Hundreds of thousands of people had been displaced, entire neighborhoods were rendered uninhabitable, and while the storm moved on, the suffering had remained. Families were scattered, homes were gone, and lives were upended permanently. The name Katrina is no longer just a hurricane. It is a symbol of failure, of vulnerability, and of heartbreak. The storm left behind more than $125 billion in damages alone, and it's still tied with Hurricane Harvey as the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history. Highways had been submerged, hospitals were incapacitated, and power grids were completely destroyed. Communications had vanished, but it was the government's response, fragmented, delayed, and woefully inadequate, that drew widespread outrage. The images of the suffering at the Superdome, the chaos at the New Orleans Convention Center, and the mass rooftop rescues underscored systemic failures in disaster preparedness at every level of government. Even years later, the city still remains a bit of a ghost of itself. Its population had dropped by more than half as its displaced residents scattered across the nation, and the road to recovery will take years. But for some, it truly never came. However, one truth was clear. Katrina had forced a reckoning, not only for New Orleans, but for the entire Gulf Coast. America would never look at hurricanes the same way again. Barely 3 weeks had passed since Hurricane Katrina had ravaged the Gulf Coast. Communities were still drowning, emergency systems still reeling, and families were still searching for missing loved ones. And yet, Mother Nature was not finished. In mid-September of 2005, the Atlantic gave birth to another storm, one that would quickly evolve into a new nightmare, and its name was Rita. Within hours of organizing in the Caribbean, Rita began strengthening as it entered the Gulf of Mexico. The water was warm, dangerously so, and the atmosphere provided little resistance. Over the next 2 days, the storm underwent explosive intensification. Winds roared to upwards of 175 miles per hour, and its central pressure plunged to a record 895 millibars. At the time, that was the 4th lowest ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin. It was eerily reminiscent of Katrina, but this time the crosshairs had drifted westward and toward a far larger target. Rita was setting her sights on the Houston metro area and its nearly 5 million plus residents. As Rita's forecast track zeroed in on southeast Texas, panic swept across the region. Officials called for mass evacuations, and the public responded. Over 3 million people attempted to flee the Houston and Galveston areas, triggering one of the largest mass evacuations in US history. And consequently, the highways turned into parking lots. For some, fuel ran out, leaving them stranded, languishing in the sweltering 100+ degree Texas heat. Tragically, more than 100 people died during the exodus, not from the storm itself, but from accidents, heat stroke, and in one horrifying case, a fire aboard a bus carrying nursing home residents. It was a grim reminder. The logistics of evacuation can become as deadly as the storm they are meant to escape. Fortunately for Houston, Rita's track turned to the east, mostly sparing the metro area. Additionally, as the storm neared shore, it began to weaken. Still, what came ashore in the early hours of September 24th, 2005 was nothing short of destructive. Rita struck just east of Sabine Pass along the Texas-Louisiana border as a strong Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds nearing 120 miles an hour. The storm hurled an unsurvivable 20-foot surge into the coastline, submerging most of Cameron Parish, Louisiana. Whole communities vanished beneath the water. Homes were lifted from their foundations. Infrastructure, already strained by Katrina, buckled under the pressure. Torrential rains exceeding 15 inches in some areas pushed rivers beyond their banks and drowned roads and neighborhoods alike. Damage estimates reached up to $12 billion across Texas and Louisiana. Oil rigs and refineries throughout the Gulf suffered heavy losses, briefly tightening an already constrained fuel supply across the United States. Power lines were toppled, hospitals shut down, and entire parishes were left inaccessible. And perhaps most painfully for storm-weary communities in western Louisiana, Rita had felt like a second punch in a 1-2 blow. Areas that were still flooded and still picking up the pieces from Katrina were struck again. And the already thin fabric of an emergency response, which was already stretched to its limit, was tested once more. Hurricane Rita didn't just follow Katrina. It compounded the damage, deepening the suffering, and exposed just how vulnerable the Gulf Coast had remained. One storm may have shocked the nation, but two, back-to-back, made it clear. This wasn't just an anomaly, this was a season of reckoning. As October unfolded, the 2005 hurricane season showed no signs of relenting. The calendar might have suggested a winding down, but the atmosphere had other plans. And from the warm, storm-breeding waters of the Western Caribbean came a new threat, one that would shatter records and redefine the upper limits of hurricane intensity in the Atlantic Basin. This storm was Hurricane Wilma. Wilma began modestly, developing in mid-October as the 21st named storm of the year, a milestone that tied the season with the infamous 1933 season for the most storms in recorded history. But 2005 wasn't nearly finished writing the record books. On October 18th, Wilma underwent one of the most explosive periods of intensification ever observed in a tropical cyclone. In less than 24 hours, Wilma went from a disorganized tropical storm to a Category 5 juggernaut. Its sustained winds surged past 175 miles per hour, and its central pressure, it collapsed to an astonishing 882 millibars, which is still the lowest pressure ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin from a tropical cyclone. Meteorologists watched in awe as Wilma shrank into a tightly wound engine of devastation, its eye contracting to a pinprick, just 2 to 3 miles wide, the smallest ever documented in an Atlantic hurricane. It was compact, ferocious, and it was on the move. Wilma then took aim at Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. On October 21st, it made landfall on Cozumel and the adjacent coast as a Category 4, unleashing punishing winds and torrential rain. But Wilma didn't move quickly. It stalled, lingering over the northeast Yucatan for nearly 36 hours. After finally drifting back into the Gulf, Wilma re-intensified and began accelerating towards Florida. On the morning of October 24th, it made landfall near Cape Romano on the state's southwestern coast in Collier County as a strong Category 3 hurricane. Wilma crossed the Florida peninsula with astonishing speed, racing from coast to coast in just over 5 hours. But its velocity didn't dull its impact. From Naples to Fort Lauderdale, from Miami to West Palm Beach, Wilma carved a swath of destruction. Skyscrapers lost windows, traffic lights hung twisted over empty intersections, trees, signs, and utility poles littered the streets like matchsticks. More than 6 million Floridians were plunged into the darkness as the power grid collapsed under the strain. Though the storm didn't linger long enough to dump catastrophic rainfall, it left behind an estimated $20 billion in damage across Florida. Wilma was a storm of extremes. Fastest intensification, lowest pressure, tiniest eye, and symbolically, it marked a breaking point. When the name Wilma was assigned, it exhausted the National Hurricane Center's predetermined list of names for the season, and for the first time in history, forecasters had to turn to the Greek alphabet to name the storms that were still to come. Many have asked, what made 2005 so extraordinary? Why did this particular year unleash a seemingly unending parade of storms, many of them record-breaking in intensity, number, and impact? Well, meteorologists and climatologists have spent the last 20 years analyzing the factors that aligned to create what can only be described as the perfect storm season. The answer isn't just one element, but rather a rare and volatile combination of oceanic heat, atmospheric calm, long-term climate cycles, and, well, geography. Nature's variables that year didn't just cooperate, they conspired. At the heart of it all was the heat. Sea surface temperatures across the tropical Atlantic in 2005 weren't just warm, they were record-breaking. The Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean in particular were running several degrees above the long-term average. This is more than just a footnote. Warm water is the lifeblood of hurricanes, after all, and the fuel that powers them is heat engines. The hotter the ocean, the more latent heat energy a storm can draw to intensify. In 2005, the Atlantic was essentially a loaded gun, with storms like Katrina, Rita, and Wilma pulling the trigger. But warm water alone doesn't a hurricane make. The atmosphere above also played an unusually cooperative role. Vertical wind shear, the difference in wind speed and direction at different altitudes in the atmosphere, was remarkably low during the 2005 season. Ordinarily, strong wind shear acts like a kind of barrier, tilting or ripping apart the developing storm before they can organize. But in 2005, upper-level winds were tranquil. A persistent high-pressure ridge over the southeastern United States, paired with a La Nina-like pattern in the Pacific, helped suppress the shear and allowed storms to grow vertically. It was like removing all the traffic from the highway, and storms had a clear path to develop, strengthen, and travel towards land. Adding another layer to the setup was a broader, slower-moving force, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or AMO. This natural climate cycle, lasting several decades, alternates between warm and cool phases. Since the mid-1990s, the Atlantic had been in a warm phase, which is actually associated with above-average hurricane activity. In 2005, this long-term background signal added even more fuel to the fire, enhancing conditions like a stronger West African monsoon, which sends many Atlantic storms as tropical waves, and establishing favorable pressure gradients that supported storm formation and westward movement. Equally important was where the storms were forming. In many active seasons, cyclones originate far out into the central Atlantic, giving them time to curve out to sea harmlessly. But in 2005, storm genesis skewed closer to home, particularly in the Caribbean Sea and in the Gulf. This shift was partially due to an atmospheric pressure pattern and sea surface temperatures, but had a profound effect. Storms had less distance to travel before reaching populated coastlines, and they did so with little warning. By the end of July, an unprecedented 7 named storms had already formed, several just a short distance from the US coastline. For meteorologists, 2005 became a case study, not just in what nature can do, but in how intricate, interdependent systems can produce staggering consequences when conditions are aligned just right. The question now just wasn't whether it could happen again, but when. The 2005 hurricane season did more than break records. It broke lives, communities, and, in many ways, our nation's sense of preparedness. In its wake, the country was forced to confront a brutal reality, one that even the most powerful nation on Earth could be humbled by wind, water, and systemic failure. The scars it left behind were not only physical, they were emotional, political, and generational. Katrina exposed what happens when bureaucracy collides with catastrophe. The images of thousands stranded at the Superdome and Convention Center, hungry, dehydrated, begging for help that would take days to arrive, became a national shame. In response, Congress passed the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act in 2006, a sweeping overhaul of FEMA's structure and mission, and billions were poured into improving logistics, disaster planning, and communication systems. But the changes weren't just technical, they were philosophical. The federal government had learned, painfully, that preparation must be proactive, not reactive, and that lives depend on what's done before a storm makes landfall. New Orleans became ground zero for another transformation, the reinvention of its flood protection system. The levee failures in Katrina were not just structural, they were symbolic of years of underinvestment, neglect, and mismanagement. With Katrina fresh in their minds, Congress approved over $14 billion to redesign and reinforce the region's defenses. Engineers have since built a sprawling system of upgraded levees, flood walls, and surge barriers designed to protect the city from a 100-year storm. And by 2012, the project was largely completed. The 2005 season became a touchstone, referenced in almost every discussion since about intensifying hurricanes and the need for resilience in coastal cities. And at the community level, change was hard-earned and deeply personal. New building codes were implemented, evacuation plans were rewritten, emergency supply lines were rethought. In Texas, where Rita's evacuation had turned deadly, officials reimagined how to move millions of people without triggering chaos. Across the Gulf Coast, lessons were absorbed not just by policymakers, but by ordinary citizens. People who now kept generators in their garages, storm shutters on their windows, and escape routes in their minds. As we pass the 20th anniversary of the 2005 hurricane season this year, we don't just remember it as the typical sequence of storms. We remember it as a season that revealed our deepest vulnerabilities, and in doing so, forcing us to begin the long, painful journey towards resilience. Hey everybody, I hope you really liked this video. If you did, please feel free to give it a thumbs up and make sure to like and subscribe, ring that bell so you don't miss more content like it in the future. Thanks again, CJ with Florida Man Weather.